The deepest cold Ellen Marsh ever felt did not come from the winter of 1889, though that winter would kill 9 grown men in Custer County before spring. It came on a warm September afternoon, for months earlier, when the front pew of the Rock Creek Methodist Chapel turned its collective head to look at her, and every mouth in that pew smiled the same small, careful smile, the kind of smile people use when they are certain, in the quiet marrow of themselves, that they are being kind by pitying you. She was 29 years old. She had a schoolteacher's straight back and a schoolteacher's stubborn hands. Her hair was the color of wet oak bark, parted in the middle and pulled into a low knot that she pinned every morning without a mirror. Her eyes were a plain, careful gray. She wore a high-collared dark blue wool dress that reached the tops of her leather boots, long sleeves buttoned at the wrists, a black shawl folded neatly over her shoulders. She looked, on that afternoon, exactly like what she was, a woman about to marry a widower named Jonah Ryland who owned nothing but 40 acres of played-out sagebrush, a mule with a broken tooth, and 3 living children. The children sat in the front pew beside their father, and the town watched them the way people watch a wagon with a bad axle roll past. The oldest was Samuel, 10 years old, thin as a fence rail, dark hair cut too short by his own hand, wearing a coat that had been mended 3 times at the elbows. The middle child was Ruth, 8, with hair the color of unpolished brass and a face that had learned to hold still. And the youngest was little May, for, in a gray gingham dress with a hem that had been let down twice, her small hands folded exactly the way her sister had folded them for her. Jonah Ryland himself was a lean, sun-scoured man in his 35th year, black beard shot through with early gray, one long knife scar down the back of his left hand that he never spoke about. He wore his one clean shirt and a coat that did not fit him anymore. Ellen Marsh married him on a Saturday afternoon at 4 o'clock. The chapel had 37 people in it. 29 of them believed she was making the worst decision of her life. She heard the whispers as she walked out under the chapel's low pine beam. She heard the word foolish. She heard the word desperate. She heard the word charity. And she heard, more clearly than anything, the voice of her own aunt from the back row, murmuring to a neighbor, "She'll be a widow with 4 mouths by Christmas, mark it." And she did not turn her head, and she did not slow her step, because she had already made her decision 3 months earlier on a Tuesday evening in Jonah Ryland's kitchen, when little May had climbed onto her lap without being invited and gone to sleep with one small hand knotted into the collar of her dress. Ellen Marsh had learned a long time ago that the town of Rock Creek would forgive her almost anything except being right, and she was going to be right, and it was going to cost her. The reason the town believed she was a fool was simple, and it was public, and it was signed in ink at the Custer County Land Office. Jonah Ryland's 40 acres were the worst 40 acres in the county. Everyone knew this. Old Man Ryland, Jonah's father, had bought the parcel in 1861 from a broken-up estate for almost nothing and had died on it before he could improve it. The 40 acres sat at the mouth of a narrow, unnamed canyon on the north edge of the county. Dry sagebrush ridge on one side, a shallow flat of white alkali soil on the other, and behind the cabin a wall of granite that the wind used as a whistle every winter. Nothing grew there worth grazing. The creek at the back of the property ran 3 months a year and then vanished. 2 of Jonah's neighbors had tried to buy the parcel from him at various times, always for less than it was worth on paper, and each time he had thanked them politely and said no, and each time they had walked away shaking their heads at the stubbornness of a man who would rather die poor on bad ground than sell. What the town did not know, what only Ellen Marsh knew because Jonah Ryland had told her on that same Tuesday evening in his kitchen with little May asleep in her lap, was that beyond the granite wall, up the narrow canyon that no one ever climbed because the mouth of it looked like a dead end, there was a valley. It was 1.5 miles long, 3/4 of a mile across at its widest, and it belonged in full and undisputed title to Jonah Ryland and would belong, upon marriage, to his wife. The valley had a spring that never stopped running. It had bottomland black as coffee grounds. It had 2 stands of old-growth ponderosa. It had a natural hot seep at the north end that steamed even in January. And, running in a vein along its western wall, it had a lode of silver lead or that Jonah's father had found in the last year of his life, had assayed in secret in Denver, and had left behind in a single sealed letter under the floorboards of the cabin. The vein, when it was finally proven in the spring of 1890 by an independent surveyor sent up from Leadville, would be valued conservatively and only at the surface exposure at $80 million in 1890 money. But that was next spring. And on this Saturday afternoon in September of 1889, Ellen Marsh walked out of the Rock Creek Methodist Chapel with 3 children whose names she had learned in the exact order they had learned to trust her, and with a husband she had already come to love the way a well loves its water. Quietly, without ever announcing it. And the town watched her go and pitied her, and she said nothing, because saying anything would have meant explaining, and explaining would have meant losing what they had. She did not know, that afternoon, that a man in the back of the chapel was watching her too, and that he already knew about the valley. She did not know that the same man had visited Jonah Ryland twice in the previous year with an offer to buy the 40 acres, and had been refused twice, and had left the second time without saying goodbye. She did not know that within 4 months, this man would try to take the valley from her by killing her husband and framing her for it. She did not know that a small yellow and black cattle dog named Whistle, who was, at that moment, asleep under the wedding wagon with his chin on his paws, would be the only witness who could not be intimidated. She did not know any of this. She only knew that Ruth had reached up and taken her hand as they walked out of the chapel, and that Ruth's hand was warm, and that the town's pity was the coldest thing she had ever felt. They rode home in a hired wagon along the North Road, with the September sun laying long amber stripes across the sagebrush and Whistle trotting behind because he refused to ride in wagons. Jonah drove. Ellen sat beside him with little May on her lap. Samuel and Ruth sat in the wagon bed with a wooden crate of Ellen's schoolbooks between them. Nobody spoke for the first 2 miles. Then Samuel, who had not smiled once at the ceremony, said quietly to the back of Ellen's neck, "Miss Marsh, do we call you Ma now or something else?" And Ellen, who had been prepared for almost every question a person could ask her that day, was not prepared for that one, and she turned around in the wagon seat with the wind pulling at the loose hair by her ear, and she said, "Whatever you want to call me is what I'll answer to, Samuel. Take your time." And Samuel did not answer for another mile, and then he said, "All right," and turned his face back to the road, and Ellen understood without being told that she had passed some kind of small, silent test. That night, in the cabin at the mouth of the canyon, Ellen unpacked her books onto a shelf Jonah had built for her out of split cedar. She hung her Sunday coat on a peg by the door. She helped Ruth wash the supper dishes in a tin basin. She brushed and braided little May's brass-colored hair by lamplight, and little May fell asleep halfway through the second braid with her head on Ellen's knee. Samuel, who had been chopping kindling in the yard long past the hour when the light had gone, came in and set the basket by the stove without meeting her eyes and went to his cot behind the curtain. Jonah, when the children were down, sat with Ellen at the kitchen table with the sealed letter from his father between them and did not touch it. He said, "My father wrote what he wrote so I would have a choice. I have made mine. The valley is not gold, Ellen. Silver lead is heavy work and it will draw men to us. My father knew. He kept it quiet. That is why we still have it." Ellen said, "I understand." Jonah said, "If the town knew, we would not be married 4 days before somebody tried to take it." Ellen said, "Then let them keep pitying us." Jonah looked at her for a long moment and then he said, "That is what I hoped you would say." And he put the letter back under the floorboards, and Ellen put her hand on his once. Briefly, formally, the way a woman puts her hand on a plow handle to feel the balance of it, and then she got up and went to the small back room he had built for her before the wedding, where a narrow iron bed waited with a white cotton quilt on it, and she slept without dreaming. She woke before dawn the next morning, which was Sunday, and she woke to a sound she did not immediately recognize, because it had been 6 years since she had lived in a house where such a sound was possible. It was the sound of a small child breathing on the other side of a wall. Little May had climbed out of her own cot in the loft at some point in the night, had come down the narrow ladder without waking anyone, and was asleep on the floor outside Ellen's door with her cheek on her folded hands and a wool blanket dragged behind her like a plow furrow. Ellen sat up in the dark for a full minute before she understood what to do. Then she got up without lighting the lamp, and she picked little May up as carefully as she had ever picked up anything in her life, and she carried her into the small back room and laid her down on the outside edge of the narrow iron bed, and she covered her with the white cotton quilt, and she lay down on the floor beside the bed on a folded coat, and she went back to sleep. That was the first thing that happened in Ellen Marsh's marriage. She did not tell Jonah about it in the morning. Jonah found out 3 months later, when Ruth asked him at supper why Ma sometimes slept on the floor, and Jonah, who by then knew his wife well enough to know the answer without needing it explained, only smiled at Ruth and said, "Because your mother is a schoolteacher, and schoolteachers know that the softest bed is the one where the child sleeps." The first 2 months of the marriage did what most marriages do not do. They passed without argument. Ellen taught the children by the kitchen table 2 afternoons a week from the primers she had brought with her, and she wrote out arithmetic problems on a small slate that had been her own as a girl. Ruth, who had been quiet as glass for 2 years, began to speak in full sentences by the second week. Little May learned the word ma without being taught it. She used it first on a Thursday morning when Ellen was pulling a cornbread pan out of the stove, and Ellen, whose eyes had not filled in 6 years, had to turn her face to the wall for a moment before she could answer. Samuel remained careful. He watched Ellen with his father's eyes for 6 weeks before he brought her the fence post that had cracked in the north pasture and asked her, without preamble, if she thought oak or ash would set better in dry soil, and Ellen, who did not know the answer, said, "Let us look it up together," and they did, and after that Samuel called her ma without ceremony. Ellen began the ledger 3 weeks into the marriage. She had bought the small leather book in Denver at the age of 16, on the one and only trip she had ever taken with her father before he died, and it had sat in the bottom of her trunk and used for 13 years because she had never been able to think of a use for it that was worthy of the leather. She opened it for the first time on a Wednesday afternoon in early October, at the kitchen table with Ruth watching over her elbow. She drew 2 columns on the first page. She labeled the left column firewood and the right column weather. She wrote, at the top of the page, in her small clean hand, 1889, Autumn, Ryland Homestead, North Road, Custer County. Then she began to record every morning at 6 and every evening at 9, how many pieces of wood the stove had eaten in the previous 12 hours, and what the sky had looked like, and whether the wind was from the north or the west, and whether Whistle had done anything unusual. Jonah, who had never kept records of any kind, saw the ledger open on the table one morning and stopped in the doorway and looked at it for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Ellen, my father used to keep one of these. He kept it in the same drawer where the letter is. I did not know why he did it." Ellen said, "He did it because a farm is a slow experiment, Jonah, and an experiment without numbers is only a story." Jonah did not answer for a long moment. Then he said, "My father would have liked you very much." And Ellen said, "He already did, Jonah. He liked me before you did. That is why he made you tell me about the valley on the second night." And Jonah, for the first time in the marriage, laughed out loud, and Ruth, who had been listening from the loft, laughed too, and Ellen went back to writing in the ledger and did not look up, because she did not want either of them to see her face. Jonah worked. He worked the way men who have been widowed work, from before the light until after it, clearing sage, mending fence, hauling water from the good spring inside the canyon down to the low cistern behind the cabin. He never took Ellen up the canyon in those first weeks. He said, "The valley will keep. I want the children to see you as their mother before they see you as a landowner." Ellen agreed. And when the town of Rock Creek came out on the 3rd Sunday in October to watch the widow schoolteacher walk into the chapel with 3 children who called her Ma, the town did not know what to do with itself, because the schoolteacher wore the same high-collared wool dress and the same black shawl she had worn at the wedding, and the children were fed, and the middle daughter was smiling, and the pity had nowhere to sit. The pity, being homeless, curdled. This is what pity does when it is denied. The whispers changed in the 2nd month. "She married him for something," one of the deacon's wives said at the general store, "and it was not for love. She is a schoolteacher and she married a widower with 40 acres of nothing. There is something in the ground he has not told anyone." The whispers were not loud and they were not organized, but they traveled the way whispers travel in a small county in 1889, from the general store to the post office to the blacksmith's shed, and from there to a man named Curran Bellwether who had lived for 8 years in the largest house in Rock Creek, and who had already visited Jonah Ryland twice with an offer to buy his 40 acres. Curran Bellwether was 51 years old that autumn. He was tall and thick through the shoulders and clean-shaven, with iron-gray hair that he cut himself every 3 weeks with a straight razor and a hand mirror. He wore black wool suits year-round because he believed that black wool suits made men listen. He owned the Rock Creek Stagecoach franchise, the North Road Toll House, a quarter interest in the Custer County Bank, and a 2-story house with painted shutters. He was, by every measure the town used, the county's most prosperous man. What the town did not know, what only 2 other men in the county knew, was that Curran Bellwether had been lent $19,000 by an East Coast investment syndicate in the summer of 1888, on the strength of his personal representation that he could deliver clear title to a proven silver lead lode on the north edge of the county within 24 months. He had not yet delivered. His deadline was March of 1890. Bellwether had known about the vein for 2 years. His source had been Jonah Ryland's father's own assayer in Denver, a man named Prater, who had drunk 1 glass of rye too many at a mining club dinner and mentioned an unusual assay from a small parcel in Custer County, and who had been paid in the following week $120 in cash by a stranger to produce a copy of the paperwork. The stranger was Bellwether's clerk. The paperwork was in Bellwether's safe. And the deed to the 40 acres and the sealed canyon behind them was, at that moment, in Jonah Ryland's floorboards, in a marriage now witnessed by every literate person in Rock Creek and sanctified in the county courthouse. Bellwether understood the arithmetic. As long as Jonah Ryland lived, the 40 acres could not be taken. Even if Jonah Ryland died, his widow, a schoolteacher named Ellen Marsh who could read a contract as quickly as any man in Denver, would inherit, and the 3 children would inherit after her. A direct offer had failed twice. A slow squeeze on the toll house, which controlled the road out to the county seat, had not moved Jonah either. The man simply drove around it. The old ways of pressing a small landholder, a bad line on the water rights, a fabricated fence dispute, a quiet threat, would draw notice now that the widow had children and a schoolteacher's letters. There was only one way left, and it required something Bellwether himself could not do. He hired a man named Josiah Kem in the first week of November. Kem was 38, a former Army teamster with a squint in his left eye and a habit of chewing the ends of his own mustache. He owed the Custer County Bank $411. He was told that his debt would be forgiven and that he would be paid $200 additional in Colorado gold if he would ride out to the Ryland place on a night to be specified and do a thing that Bellwether described to him in a low, careful voice in the back office of the stagecoach shed.
Kem Lifsten.
He asked one question, which was, what happens to the woman, and Bellwether said, if she is fortunate, nothing. If she is unfortunate, that is what a sheriff is for. And Kem, who had a wife of his own in Kansas whom he had not seen in 3 years and a boy in Missouri whom he had not seen in 5, chewed the end of his mustache and nodded once and said, done. And that would have been the end of it, and Ellen Marsh would have been a widow before the winter solstice, if it had not been for a small yellow and black cattle dog named Whistle, who was, in the second week of November, sleeping on a rag rug beside Ruth Ryland's cot and who had begun, for reasons that no one in the cabin yet understood, to bark at the north pasture fence 3 times a night. Whistle was 5 years old that autumn. He had been Jonah Ryland's dog since he was a pup, and he had not been Jonah Ryland's dog for a full month before he had rearranged himself into Ruth's dog, because Ruth was the child in the house who most needed a dog, and dogs of his breed understand this by instinct. He was low-slung and wire-muscled, with the yellow of an old wheat field on his sides and a black saddle across his back, and the white of a good bandage on his throat, and ears that lay against his skull in a state of constant, patient listening. He had one habit that Jonah had never trained out of him and had never wanted to. He refused to bark at nothing. If Whistle barked, there was something to bark at. And in the second week of November, 3 nights running, Whistle barked at the north pasture fence between the hours of 1 and 3 in the morning, in a low, careful bark that was not a warning to the coyotes but a report to the humans in the cabin. Something is at the fence. Something has been at the fence. Something will be at the fence again. Jonah walked the fence line on the 4th morning. He found what he expected to find. Nothing. A pair of boot prints that could have been anybody's, half scoured by wind, in the dry alkali at the corner post. A cigarette end that no rider in Rock Creek smoked, because it was hand-rolled with a Kansas-cut leaf that only 2 stores in the county sold. And, on the 3rd post from the corner, a small charcoal mark shaped like a Roman numeral I. Jonah stood looking at the mark for a long moment. Then he walked back to the cabin and told Ellen what he had found, and Ellen, who had grown up on a farm in Missouri where her father had once been driven off his land by a neighbor's slow campaign of fence marks, went very quiet for a moment and then said, "We should not sleep in the cabin without one of us awake," and Jonah said, "I agree," and they made a schedule that same afternoon. They kept the schedule for 11 nights. On the 12th night, which was the second Friday in November and unusually still, Whistle did not bark. He did the opposite. He stood up from his rag rug beside Ruth's cot at 2 in the morning, walked to the kitchen door, and pressed his nose against the crack between door and jamb and stayed there. Ellen, who had the second half of the watch that night and was sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp turned low and a book of arithmetic problems in her lap, watched him do this and felt the small hairs on the backs of her forearms lift under her sleeves. She stood up quietly. She woke Jonah. Jonah took the shotgun from the peg beside the door and went out to the porch. Ellen followed with the lamp shuttered. Whistle stayed at the doorframe. He did not follow. He never followed on that kind of night. There was a man on the north side of the cabin. He was crouched by the woodpile with his back to them. He was holding something long in his right hand and something small and dark in his left. When Jonah said, "Stand up slow," the man did not stand up slow. He turned. He fired. The shotgun in Jonah's hands answered a heartbeat later. And when Ellen ran forward with the shuttered lamp to see what had happened, she found her husband on his knees in the yard with his left hand pressed against his shoulder and blood coming through the fingers dark as tar in the lamplight. And she found the stranger 15 paces away on his side in the sage with a load of birdshot across his ribs and the small dark thing still in his hand. The small dark thing was a bottle of coal oil. The long thing beside him in the dirt was a Kansas-cut cigarette, unlit. His name, when the sheriff arrived 4 hours later, would turn out to be Josiah Kim. He would live long enough to be carried to town in the back of the same wagon that had brought Ellen home 4 months earlier as a bride, and he would die at 8 o'clock the following morning in the doctor's back room in Rock Creek, and he would not speak the name of the man who had hired him, because Curran Bellwether had been careful to hire him in a way that Kem himself could not fully prove. But before he died, Kem did one thing that Bellwether had not planned for. He asked to see the woman. And when Ellen Marsh stood at the foot of the doctor's cot in her long dark blue dress with her husband's blood dried on the cuff of her sleeve, Josiah Kem looked at her with the good eye and said, in a voice that was mostly breath, "Ma'am, I want you to know, the man who paid me has your husband's father's assay paper in his safe," and Ellen Marsh said quietly, "Thank you." That was all. But she remembered. Jonah Ryland lived. He lost the use of his left arm for 11 weeks, and he carried a second scar to keep the first one company for the rest of his life. But he lived, and by the 3rd week of December he was strong enough to sit up at the kitchen table and eat what Ellen and Ruth cooked for him. The sheriff of Custer County, a plodding, honest man named Elias Boone, wrote up the incident as an attempted arson repelled in defense of home and family, ruled it justified, and closed the file. What Boone did not know was that Ellen Marsh, on the same afternoon he closed the file, had written a letter of her own, in a schoolteacher's careful hand, to a lawyer in Denver whose name she had gotten from her father's old attorney in Missouri. The letter said, among other things, "I have reason to believe that a man in our county holds, in his private safe, a copy of an assay document lawfully belonging to my husband's late father. I intend to prove this. I will pay your fee in specie upon successful recovery. Please advise." The letter went out on the morning stagecoach on December the 8th. Curran Bellwether, who owned the stagecoach franchise, did not read Ellen Marsh's outgoing letters, because Ellen Marsh had asked the postmaster to seal her letters with wax in his presence, and the postmaster, an old man named Griggs whose wife had once been Ellen's teacher at the age of 9, had agreed with a small grave nod and had done it every time. The town of Rock Creek learned in the first week of December that Jonah Ryland had been shot and had survived. It did not learn much else. Ellen Marsh, when she came into the general store on a Tuesday afternoon for salt and thread, spoke calmly and briefly to the storekeeper's wife, and said only that a man had come onto the property with a bottle of coal oil and had been stopped, and that her husband was recovering. The storekeeper's wife, who had been one of the pew smilers at the wedding 4 months earlier, was seen to blink twice and to hand over the salt and the thread without charging for either. Ellen paid anyway. She always paid. The pity, which had already curdled into suspicion, curdled again into something the town could not name. If the widow schoolteacher had married a broke widower with 3 children for something in the ground, why had somebody tried to burn the cabin? What did the somebody know that the town did not? These were not questions the town could ask out loud. They were the questions the town asked in the space between 2 sentences at the general store, and in the way one deacon's wife nodded at another deacon's wife as they passed each other in the road. And still, in the largest house in Rock Creek, Curran Bellwether sat at his mahogany desk and read the newspaper and drank his morning coffee and did not know that a letter was already in Denver, and did not know that a lawyer was already writing back. The letter from Denver reached Ellen Marsh on the afternoon of the 17th of December. It said, "Mrs. Ryland, your description of the assay document is consistent with a document filed in this office in the summer of 1885 by 1 J. Prater, assayer, on behalf of 1 G. Ryland. A duplicate is held in this office by right of long practice. Your husband is entitled to a certified copy upon written request. As to the matter of a private safe, please instruct me by return whether you wish to proceed by civil suit or by criminal complaint. The undersigned is available for consultation upon your convenience. Signed, T. R. Halliday, Attorney at Law, Denver, Colorado." Ellen Marsh read the letter twice by the kitchen window with the winter light making a pale rectangle on the floor at her feet, and then she folded it into thirds and put it inside the sleeve of her dress, and then she went outside and stood in the yard for a long minute with her hand on Whistle's flat yellow head, and Whistle looked up at her and did not move, and Ellen said quietly to the dog, "We are going to have a hard winter, and we are going to be ready for it," and Whistle, who understood almost every word Ellen ever spoke to him, wagged his tail once and went back to watching the north pasture fence. The hard winter did not knock. It arrived on the second Saturday of January in 1890, in a form that the older men in Rock Creek would still be talking about in the summer of 1912. It began with 3 days of unusual warmth, the kind of false warmth that Colorado ranchers had learned by 1890 to distrust the way sailors distrust a red morning, and it ended with an ice storm that laid 1/4 of an inch of solid glass across every fence, every roof, every horse trough, every wagon, and every window in Custer County. Then, on the 4th day, the wind came out of the north at a speed that broke the anemometer at the county seat, and the temperature dropped from 29 degrees above zero at noon to 19 degrees below zero at midnight, and it did not rise above zero again for 9 days. Ellen Marsh had already been ready for 11 weeks. She had begun the day after Jonah was shot. Her method was not new. Her method was, in fact, an old one, and she had learned it from her father in Missouri, and her father had learned it from a Norwegian carpenter who had built barns for the state fair, and the Norwegian had learned it from his own grandfather in a village north of Trondheim where snow was not weather but landscape. The method was called, in the schoolbooks Ellen had brought with her, the principle of trapped air insulation, and its short form was the cryptic wisdom line that Ellen said out loud to Ruth on the afternoon of November the 28th, while the two of them were nailing a second layer of split cedar to the outside of the cabin's north wall. "Keeping heat matters more than making heat," Ellen said. Ruth, who was holding the nail box on her hip, looked up at her stepmother with her brass-colored hair coming loose from its braid and said, "Is that why we are putting wood over the wood?" Ellen said, "That is why. The cold does not push through wood. The cold pushes through gaps. If we lay a second wall an inch off the first wall and let the air sit between them, the air will do the work the stove would have had to do. We will burn less wood. We will stay warmer." And Samuel, who was 12 years old that winter and had heard the whole thing from the top of the ladder where he was hammering, said, "Ma, that is not how everyone else does it." And Ellen said, "No, Samuel, it is not." And Samuel said, "Are we going to be all right?" And Ellen said, "We are going to be more than all right if you keep hammering." They kept hammering for 6 weeks. They double-walled every exterior surface of the cabin except the south wall, which they lined instead with an 8-inch bank of dry sage bundles held in place by chicken wire. They sank an insulated pipe from the kitchen stove down into the crawl space and back up again on a slow return, so that the heat from the stove circled the underside of the floor before it went up the chimney, and by the time the ice storm arrived on the second Saturday of January, the crawl space of the Ryland cabin was a warm brown room the size of 2 beds and the temperature of a spring afternoon. Ellen had already moved every jar of preserves, every sack of flour, every pound of salt pork, and every apple from the root cellar into that crawl space, because she knew, she had learned from her father, that the cold would find the root cellar before it found the kitchen. The children slept in the loft, which Ellen had insulated with a triple layer of dry straw mattress sticking between the roof beams and the interior boards. Whistle slept on his rag rug beside Ruth's cot. Ellen and Jonah slept in the small back room, which now had a second door built 2 feet inside the first, forming a small entry chamber that trapped the outside cold before it reached them, in the way the vestibule of a Russian country house does. By the second Saturday of January, the Ryland cabin was, without anyone in the town of Rock Creek knowing it, the warmest structure in Custer County that was not built of stone. Getting the cabin to that state had not been simple. It had been 3 maintenance failures. The first failure came on the 11th of December, during a small cold snap that pushed the outside temperature to 14 degrees below zero for 2 nights, when Ellen woke at 4 in the morning to a smell she did not like. A faint sourness at the back of the throat, half wood smoke and half something else, and she got up and lit the lamp and walked barefoot to the stove and put her hand flat against the pipe where it went into the crawl space, and the pipe was cold. Not warm with a cold patch. Cold. The heated air she had designed to circle the crawl space was, at that moment, running backwards. She woke Samuel. Samuel, who by then knew every piece of pipe in the house by feel, crouched in the crawl space with a candle for 11 minutes and came back up and said, "Ma, the elbow at the north turn is loose. The draft is coming down instead of going down. It is pulling cold in." And Ellen said, "Can you fix it before morning?" And Samuel said, "I can." He did. He wrapped the elbow in a strip of wet leather he cut off an old harness, and by the time the strip dried it had shrunk tight around the joint, and the pipe never ran backwards again. Ellen wrote the failure in the ledger and the fix and the leather strip. The second failure came on the 17th, when frost formed on the inside of the north window because the double wall had not been extended above the window lintel, and Jonah, weak as he still was, sat up in bed and directed Samuel through the addition of 6 feet of overhead double wall in a single afternoon. The third failure came on the 22nd, when Whistle refused to go into the crawl space for his morning nap, and Ruth, who understood him better than any of them, followed him to the far corner and found a hairline crack in the foundation stone that was letting a thin ribbon of ground damp up into the warm cavity. Ellen packed the crack with a mixture of clay and dry sage, sealed it with pitch, and the crawl space held its temperature within 1 degree for the next 11 weeks. She wrote each failure and each fix. She wrote them not because she was proud of them, but because her father had taught her that a system is not a system until it has failed in 3 different ways and been repaired in 3 different ways, and she believed him. Ellen kept a thermometer nailed to the inside wall beside the kitchen stove and a second thermometer nailed to the outside of the north wall beside the woodpile, and she wrote the readings every morning at 6 o'clock and every evening at 9 o'clock in a small leather ledger she had bought in Denver during her one visit there as a girl. She wrote them for the same reason her father had written his, which was that numbers, once written down, cannot be argued with by anyone including the person who wrote them. On the first morning of the storm, Sunday, January the 12th, 1890, the outside thermometer read 6 degrees above zero at 6 o'clock in the morning, and the inside thermometer read 58 degrees above zero. On the third morning, Tuesday, the outside thermometer read 11 degrees below zero, and the inside thermometer read 54 degrees. On the sixth morning, Friday, the outside thermometer read 19 degrees below zero, and the inside thermometer read 51 degrees. Ellen wrote these numbers into her ledger with a schoolteacher's small clean hand. She fed her stove 1 armload of dry pine every 12 hours, no more. In the town of Rock Creek that same week, the men who had come out of the general store to laugh at her wedding 4 months earlier were burning 3 armloads of green fir every 4 hours in stoves that were roaring red and heating rooms that read 39 degrees above zero at breakfast, and their wives were wearing coats indoors, and their children were wearing wool caps to bed. The town did not know this yet. The town could not know it, because the ice storm had brought down every telegraph line in Custer County on the first night, and no wagon could move on the ice, and every road out of Rock Creek was a slick, unbroken sheet of gray glass with drifts of snow at the fences. The town knew what the town could see from its own windows, which was that the cold had come, and that the cold was not leaving, and that firewood was running down faster than firewood had ever run down before, and that the men who had gone out on Sunday to check on their cattle had come back Sunday night with 2 of them missing, and had gone out again Monday morning and found them stiff between the north fence and a corner drift with their horses still standing beside them like patient monuments. Whistle began his second signal on the 4th night of the storm. It was not a bark this time. It was a low, careful whine at the kitchen door. He did it 3 times at intervals of about 20 minutes, and each time Ellen went to the door and opened it a crack and let him look, and each time he came back inside and lay down without protest. On the third look, Ellen looked past his ear and saw what he was seeing, which was that at the very edge of what the porch lamp lit, along the sagebrush ridge on the far side of the alkali flat, there were 3 points of yellow light moving slowly along the ridge in the direction of the cabin. They were the lanterns of 3 men. The men were walking, not riding. No horse could have kept its footing on that ice, and they were carrying long shapes over their shoulders that were the shapes of rifles. They were about half a mile off. They were moving at the speed of a man who is very cold and very determined. Ellen closed the door. She walked to the small back room where Jonah was sitting up in bed with a book. She said, "3 men on the ridge coming this way. Bellwether has decided the storm will finish what Kem did not." Jonah put the book down. His left arm was still weak. He said, "They will come to the porch and ask to be let in. If we let them in, we do not come out again." Ellen said, "I know." Jonah said, "And if we do not let them in, they will burn the cabin." Ellen said, "They will try. But they will not succeed because they do not know how our cabin is built now, and they do not have the time we have. Get up. Get Samuel. Wake Ruth. Move May into the crawlspace on the pallet. And send Whistle to me." They did what she said. Samuel came down from the loft in his stocking feet with his heart working hard against his ribs and his father's old rifle in his hands. And Ellen took the rifle from him and set it against the wall and said, "I will not need this yet." She said, "Samuel, you and Ruth are going to sit in the crawlspace with your sister and with Whistle, and you are going to keep the small lamp lit, and you are going to keep your voices down, and you are going to trust me." Samuel looked at her for the length of one breath, and then he said, "Yes, Ma," and he went. Ruth was already going. Little May was still asleep and did not wake as her sister carried her. Ellen went to the kitchen. She picked up the ledger. She turned to a blank page. She wrote, at the top, in her small clean hand, Sunday, January 12, 1890 through Wednesday, January 22, 1890, being the days of the great ice storm and of the attempt against our house. Then she blew out the lamp. Then she walked to the north window and stood behind the muslin curtain and watched the 3 yellow lights. The 3 yellow lights reached the porch at 17 minutes past 11. They were Curran Bellwether himself, muffled to the eyes in a black wool coat with a fur collar, and a stagecoach driver named McCabe who owed Bellwether his job, and a young man named Pretty whose father owed Bellwether $300 and whose father had told him to do whatever the tall man in the black coat said. They came to the porch. They stamped the ice from their boots. Bellwether did not knock. He called out, "Mrs. Ryland, this is Curran Bellwether. We are 3 good men from town who have been walking for 6 hours to check on you and your family. Open the door." Ellen did not answer. Whistle, from the crawlspace under the floor, made no sound. He had been given his instruction. Bellwether waited half a minute. Then he said, "Mrs. Ryland, we know your husband is injured and we know you have children in there. We have brought food and blankets. Open the door." Ellen did not answer. Behind her, at the far end of the kitchen, Jonah had come out of the small back room with a shotgun in his good hand and had positioned himself where the front door, if it opened, would open toward him and not toward the loft. Bellwether waited another half-minute. Then his voice changed. Then he said quietly, in the voice he used in his back office at the stagecoach shed, "Mrs. Ryland, I know about the valley. I have known about the valley since 1887. I have papers that will be very difficult for you to explain if a certain document arrives in this county over the winter. I have come to help you. Open the door." Ellen, from behind the muslin curtain, said her first word of the night. She said no. Bellwether said, "Mrs. Ryland, be reasonable. You are a schoolteacher with 3 children and an injured husband. You will not survive this storm without help. I am offering you help." Ellen said, "We do not need help." Bellwether said, "Then I am sorry. Mr. McCabe, the north wall." And Ellen, still behind the muslin curtain, watched McCabe step off the porch and walk around to the north side of the cabin with the bottle of coal oil in his left hand and the box of Kansas-cut matches in his right, and she watched him crouch by the woodpile in the exact spot where Josiah Kem had crouched 2 months earlier, and she watched him pour the coal oil into a splash across the woodpile and reach for a match, and she said very quietly, to no one but the schoolhouse arithmetic teacher inside her own chest, "The cold hunts walls. Give it something else to find first." And then she reached up and unlatched the small brass hook on the muslin curtain, and the curtain came down, and the north window was clear, and she opened the window 6 inches, and she said out through the crack, in a voice that carried on the still ice-cold air like the ring of a small bell, "Mr. McCabe, look at your feet." McCabe looked at his feet. What McCabe saw was not what McCabe expected to see. He had expected to see the base of the north wall of the Ryland cabin. What he saw instead was a 2-inch gap between the outer wall and an inner wall he had not known was there, and from the gap, in a thin, steady exhalation, was coming a plume of warm air that had been circling under the cabin's floor for 11 weeks. The plume had melted a small clean crescent in the snow at the base of the wall, and in the crescent, between his boots and the cabin, ran a shallow trickle of water 3 fingers wide that had come from the melt and that was now, in the temperature of the storm, freezing again into a smooth pane of ice that had already spread 3 feet in every direction around him. McCabe was standing in the middle of it, and so was the pool of coal oil. Ellen said, "Still through the 6-inch gap in the north window, Mr. McCabe. If you light that match, the flame will run across the coal oil to your boots faster than you can stand up. And if you do not light it, and you turn around and walk back to the porch, I will not shoot you, and I will not tell the sheriff about the bottle in your hand, and your wife in Kansas will still have a husband on Sunday. Choose." McCabe stood very still. The wind moved past the corner of the cabin. In the crawl space under his feet, although he did not know it, Whistle was pressed against the boards, listening. Samuel, in the crawl space beside Whistle, was holding Ruth's hand so hard that Ruth would have a small bruise on the inside of her wrist for a week. Little May, on the pallet, was still asleep, because her sister had covered her ear with the flat of her palm. McCabe dropped the match. The match went out in the wet ice at his feet. He turned around. He walked back to the porch. He said to Curran Bellwether, in a voice that was mostly wind, "Mr. Bellwether, sir, I am done." Pretty, who was 17 years old that night and had never in his life seen a man refuse Curran Bellwether to his face, looked from McCabe to Bellwether and then set his rifle butt against the porch boards and did not lift it again. Bellwether stood on the porch for 11 more seconds. His breath went out from under his fur collar in a slow white plume that curled up past the porch beam. Then he said softly, "Mrs. Ryland, this is not the end of it." And Ellen, from inside the cabin, said, "Mr. Bellwether, you are correct. But it is the end of tonight. Walk back the way you came, or wait on my porch for the sheriff. Choose." He chose. He walked. All 3 of them walked, back along the sage ridge with their lanterns swinging low, and the yellow lights got smaller for a long time, and then they were gone, and it was just the wind and the ice in the cabin, and the cabin was still warm. Ellen did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her and the lamp turned very low, and she wrote what had happened, in her small clean hand, with the precision of a schoolteacher recording a lesson. She wrote the time each event had begun, the words spoken as she remembered them, the position of each man, the direction of the wind, and the exact readings from both thermometers at the moment McCabe had dropped the match. She wrote down, at the bottom of the page, the phrase her father had taught her: "Numbers do not lie. They are the only witness who will still be here in 10 years. And she underlined it once and closed the ledger, and slept an hour before dawn with her forehead on her folded arms. The storm did not break on Wednesday. It broke on Thursday, the 4th day after the attempt on the cabin, and by then Custer County had counted 7 dead men, 41 dead cattle, and 119 fence posts snapped clean off at the ground. The town of Rock Creek came out on Friday and looked at itself and did not like what it saw. Firewood was almost gone. Half a dozen roofs had cracked under the weight of ice. A widow named Alma Trask had lost the tips of 3 fingers on her left hand to frost, because her cabin had a north wall built of single-thickness pine, and she had run out of coal oil for her lamp on the 2nd night. The deacon's wife, who had smiled the smallest smile at Ellen's wedding, a woman named Priscilla Ames, had spent the storm huddled in the corner of her kitchen with her 2 children under a wool blanket and her hands wrapped in a shawl, and she had made her husband promise, on the morning the wind died, that he would go out to the Ryland place with a team and check on the schoolteacher's family, because she had thought, in the cold hours before dawn on the 3rd morning, of little May in her gray gingham dress, and she had not been able to think of anything else. Ames arrived at the Ryland place at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon with a wagon he had built up on runners like a sleigh. He came around the last bend in the north road expecting to see a chimney with no smoke, or worse. He saw, instead, a chimney with a slow, healthy plume rising from it in a thin blue line. He saw a yard swept clean of snow drifts in the shape of a careful crescent. He saw the north wall of the cabin, and he saw, at the base of the north wall, a thin ribbon of steaming melt where the plume of warm air had done its work for 11 days. He saw Samuel Ryland come out of the barn with an armload of wood that was 1/3 the size of the armload Ames had been carrying twice a day for 2 weeks. He saw Ellen Marsh in the doorway, in her long dark blue wool dress and black shawl, and her hair pinned in the same careful low knot she had worn at the wedding, and her hands in the front pocket of her apron. And Ellen said, quietly, before Ames could speak, "Mr. Ames, thank you for coming. My husband is recovering. The children are well. Please come in." Ames came in. He came in, and he took off his hat, and he sat at the kitchen table, and Ellen poured him a cup of coffee that had come from an actual bean and not from parched barley, and he looked around the room at the double walls and the second door and the ledger open on the shelf, and he said, "Mrs. Ryland, how did you know?" And Ellen said, "I did not know. I prepared. My father used to say that only one of those is a virtue." Ames looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "Ma'am, I owe you an apology from the whole town." And Ellen said, "No, Mr. Ames, you do not. You have done a kind thing today. Go home to your wife and your children. If the town wants to see how the cabin was built, I will show them in the spring." Ames nodded. He left with the coffee cup half full in his hand because he had forgotten to put it down. By Sunday, the story of the Ryland cabin's north wall had reached every kitchen in Rock Creek. By Tuesday, 3 men had come out on their own to look at the double wall and to measure the gap and to touch the stovepipe that ran into the crawlspace. By the following Sunday, 6 men, the same 6 who had smiled the small careful smiles at Ellen's wedding, had come to the chapel with their hats in their hands and had asked, through the deacon, whether they might visit the Ryland cabin and be taught the method. Jonah, who by then could sit up in a chair beside the door, looked at Ellen. Ellen looked at the 6 men. She said, "We will teach it, but you will teach the others. That is the price." They agreed. She taught them at her kitchen table with the ledger open between them, and by the end of February the town of Rock Creek had double-walled 31 cabins and 11 barns, and the price of firewood, which had tripled during the storm, began to come down again, and no widow lost the tips of any more fingers, and the winter, which had another 6 weeks to run, took no more men. But the winter was not the whole of it. The lawyer from Denver, Mr. T. R. Halliday, arrived on the 12th of February, on the first stagecoach that had come north through the pass since New Year's. He carried 3 things in a black leather case. He carried a certified copy, over the seal of the Denver Territorial Assay Office, of the assay report filed by 1J Prater on behalf of 1G. Ryland in the summer of 1885. He carried a signed affidavit, dated the 9th of February and taken in the office of the Denver District Attorney, from a man named Prater, now 68 years old and dying of a lung complaint, in which Prater confessed under oath that in the winter of 1887, he had accepted $120 from a clerk in the employ of Curran Bellwether in exchange for a duplicate copy of the assay. And he carried a formal writ, sworn out on the strength of Ellen Marsh's own written statement of the night of the 12th of January and countersigned by the deputy of Custer County, authorizing the sheriff of Custer County to open the private safe of Curran Bellwether in the presence of witnesses and to seize any document or documents matching the description of the assay report. Sheriff Elias Boone, who was a plodding honest man, read the writ twice. Then he took his hat off the peg by his desk and he walked with Halliday and with 2 deputies to the largest house in Rock Creek, and he opened the safe of Curran Bellwether in the presence of Curran Bellwether himself, and Curran Bellwether said nothing at all, because he had already understood, from the moment he saw the seal of the Denver Territorial Assay Office on the top of the writ, that his safe would contain the very document that would end him. It did. And Halliday, who had done this kind of work for 27 years, produced from his black leather case a small envelope containing a 4th item. It was a folded piece of paper the size of a playing card. It was the receipt, in Prater's own handwriting, for the $120 paid in the winter of 1887. Prater had kept the receipt, at his wife's insistence, in the false bottom of a tobacco tin in his kitchen, because his wife, who was a Presbyterian and who did not believe in bribery on general principles, had told him that if he was going to sin he was at least going to have the paperwork for it when the accounting came. The accounting had come, and Bellwether, who had never in his life imagined that the 50-cent tobacco tin of a dying assayer in Denver could be a piece of evidence against him, looked at the folded paper in Halliday's hand and set the assay report down on the mantel very slowly and did not pick it up again. Produced from his black leather case a second sealed envelope containing the written statement of Ellen Marsh regarding the events of the 12th of January, along with a signed statement by McCabe, who had come to the sheriff's office 3 weeks earlier on his own accord, describing exactly what Curran Bellwether had told him to do that night and why. Bellwether stood in his own parlor with the assay report in his hand and did not sit down. He looked at Ellen Marsh, who had walked in with the sheriff on the second knock, and he said, "Mrs. Ryland, I underestimated you." And Ellen Marsh, who had promised herself in the small back room of the cabin on the night of the wedding that she would not enjoy this moment when it came, found that she could keep her promise, and she said, "Mr. Bellwether, that was not the mistake. The mistake was that you believed the town's pity was a proof of something. It was only a habit. You copied the habit. You should have looked at us." Bellwether said softly, "I chose to believe the easiest answer. I chose to believe a schoolteacher who married a broke widower was a schoolteacher who could be moved. I looked at the shape of your dress and I did not look at your hands. That is what I chose." He was tried in Denver in April of 1890, under a change of venue granted on the strength of his ownership of the local newspaper. He was convicted of conspiracy to commit arson, conspiracy to commit murder, and grand fraud in the second degree. He served 11 years in the territorial penitentiary and died in the 12th of a stroke, unremarked, in a boarding house on the south edge of Denver where he had gone to live because no one in Custer County would take his rent. The valley, the sealed valley behind the granite wall, with the black bottomland and the spring that never stopped running and the natural hot seep at the north end and the vein of silver lead or running along the western wall, was surveyed in the spring of 1890 by an independent surveyor sent up from Leadville at the joint request of Jonah Ryland and Ellen Marsh. It assayed, at the surface exposure alone, at $80 million in 1890 dollars. Jonah and Ellen did what Jonah's father had told Jonah, in the letter under the floorboards, to do. They did not sell. They did not open the vein to strangers. They mined it slowly over 32 years in a partnership of 4: Jonah, Ellen, Samuel when he came of age, and a Cornish mining foreman named Trevithick who was hired on a wage and share arrangement drafted by Mr. Halliday. The valley never held more than 22 workers at a time. Every worker had a house with a double wall. Every house had a stovepipe that ran through its crawlspace. Every winter, in Rock Creek and in the small mining settlement that grew up in the shadow of the valley, no widow ever again lost the tips of her fingers to a north wall built too thin, and no child ever again went to bed wearing a wool cap because the stove was roaring in a house that could not hold the heat. Ellen kept teaching. She taught the Rock Creek children 2 afternoons a week, without pay, until the year she turned 71. She taught in the same long dark blue wool dress with the black shawl over her shoulders, which had been repaired at the elbows so many times that the elbows were, by the end, made almost entirely of thread. Ruth grew up to be the county's first female surveyor, licensed in the territory of Colorado in 1899, and she surveyed the second exposure of the vein herself in her mother's dress at the age of 18. Samuel grew up to be a mining engineer who wrote 3 books on structural insulation and heat retention in cold climate housing, and dedicated the first one to his mother without using her name. Little May grew up to be a doctor. She married late and quietly and well and never left the county. Whistle lived to the age of 14, which is a long life for a cattle dog, and died in the summer of 1898 in the yard of the Ryland cabin with his chin on Ruth's boot. Ruth buried him at the north corner of the double wall he had watched for so many nights, and she and her mother marked the spot with a flat granite stone the size of a school primer, and on the stone Ellen carved, with her own hands and a schoolteacher's small chisel. He barked at what was there. And on the underside of the stone, where no one but the burying could ever see it, Ruth carved a second line that her mother did not know about. He was the one who told us first. Curran Bellwether's largest house in Rock Creek was bought at auction in 1892 by the deacon's wife who had thought of little May in the cold hours before dawn. She turned it, with her husband's small savings and a loan from the Custer County Bank, into a school for orphan children, and she named the school, over Ellen Marsh's brief and unsuccessful protest, the Marsh Ryland School for the Children of the North Road. It stood, and it took children in for the next 41 years. The town of Rock Creek held a second wedding for Ellen and Jonah on the first Sunday of June in 1890. It was not a legal wedding. The legal wedding had held since September of the year before, but it was the wedding the town had refused them the first time. The chapel was full. There were 61 people in it. The deacon's wife who had thought of little May in the cold hours before dawn stood in the front pew, and she wore her one good hat, and she did not smile the small careful smile of the year before, because she had learned, in the intervening months, that the small careful smile was the smile of a person who was about to be embarrassed. Ellen wore the same long dark blue wool dress she had worn the first time. She wore it because she owned only one dress that she considered a wedding dress, and because she had decided, on the ride into town that morning, that she was going to make the same walk into the same chapel in the same clothes and give the town a chance to answer differently. The town answered differently. When Ellen and Jonah walked out under the low pine beam, the front pew stood up. Nobody had asked them to stand up. They stood up because they knew, without being told, that the standing was the closest thing they were going to get to an apology, and that the woman in front of them would accept it and would not require them to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would have been a small cruelty in return, and Ellen Marsh had learned a long time ago that returning cruelty was not a form of justice, it was only a form of tiredness. Jonah Ryland lived until 1928. He was 83. He kept the use of his left arm to the end, though he could not lift a shovel with it after the age of 60. He and Ellen never had children of their own, which surprised the town for the first 10 years and stopped surprising the town after that. In the year before he died, Jonah asked Ellen if she had ever, in the small back room of the cabin on any night of any winter, regretted the decision she had made in the front pew of the Rock Creek Methodist Chapel on the Saturday afternoon in September of 1889. Ellen looked at him for a long time. She said, "Jonah, I regretted only one thing. I regretted, for one moment, on the night the 3 lanterns came up the ridge, that I had not told them at the wedding what was in the ground." And Jonah said, "Why did you regret it?" And Ellen said, "Because I thought for that one moment that if they had known, they would not have tried." And then Jonah said quietly, "Ellen, if they had known, they would have tried sooner." And Ellen said, "Yes, I understood that by morning. I have not regretted it since." Jonah died in the small back room in his sleep, with Ellen sitting in the kitchen at the same table where she had written the ledger entry for the night of the 12th of January, 38 years earlier. The ledger, by then, was in the County Historical Society, along with the granite stone from Whistle's grave and Ellen's original thermometer. The dress Ellen had worn to her wedding was folded in a cedar chest at the foot of the bed. She wore it one final time to Jonah's funeral. It had been mended at the elbows 11 times. It was, by then, an object with a life of its own. The strongest protection is not always the one that looks strongest. The town of Rock Creek learned this from a schoolteacher who married a broke widower with 3 children on a Saturday afternoon in 1889 and became, by a route none of them could have predicted at the time, the richest woman in Custer County and the only person any of them ever fully trusted in a bad winter. They learned it slowly. They learned it in the shape of a double wall, and in the numbers of a ledger, and in the small, careful voice of a woman standing behind a muslin curtain telling a man in the ice at her feet to make a choice. They learned it because a dog named Whistle refused, all his life, to bark at nothing. And they remembered it because, long after Ellen Marsh was buried beside Jonah in the plot at the north corner of the chapel yard, in the same dress with the mended elbows, with a flat granite stone that read only Ellen M. Ryland, teacher, at her head, the double walls were still standing, and the winters were still coming, and every child in Rock Creek who was ever taught to read was also, by the same schoolteacher's inheritance, taught to bank sage against a south wall and to run a stovepipe through a crawlspace and to write the numbers down every morning at 6. And if you have not yet heard the story of the widow in the county just south of Rock Creek, who buried 31 clay pots in a circle around her cabin the summer before the blizzard of 1893, and who was called a fool by every deacon in 3 towns until the January that only her chimney smoked, you should. Because what Ellen Marsh built with a double wall, another woman built with buried clay, and the wind came for her too, and it found her ready. That is the next story, and it is worth your evening.